Hello and welcome to the I Hate Drums podcast with me, Mark, your teacher for this series. I'm a drum teacher and educator based in the Highlands of Scotland, though I'm actually from Yorkshire. If you'd like to find out more about I Hate Drums, visit my website www.ihatedrums.co.uk. We're going to continue working through my book, Intermediate 1. This is a book written at grade 3 level, and you can find this on the website as a paperback or as an ebook. My new book, The Drum Charting Assistant, can also be found here. If you're someone that's getting into playing gigs and you have to learn a lot of songs, then this book is a great resource for you to use and keep track of all those songs that you're learning. It also contains detailed charts as well as quick charts. So depending on the complexity of the song, or depending on how familiar you are with the charting process, you can either have a more detailed version for the complex songs if you're just getting started, or a quick charting version if you're more familiar. In the shop, you can also get the PDF version of this, which will just give you a 2-page printout as well as the initial instructions on how to use the charts. Today we're going to start working through lesson 3 of the book, titled Groove Extras. Now this doesn't mean fancy stuff and putting tambourines on your snare drum or anything like that. This is actually going to be adding new elements to your grooves, but also strengthening your understanding of note values. And that starts with drum-only patterns. Something I noticed quite early in my private teaching practice was that a lot of pupils could get their head around eighth note grooves very quickly, but once those hi-hats were removed, a lot of pupils found it quite difficult to tell when the bass drum and snare drum hits were falling, and that told me that their understanding of eighth notes and quarter notes wasn't necessarily as strong as I'd thought. And that's because having a quarter note or eighth note hi-hat pattern or ride pattern gives you a kind of grid to follow. You can read each of those hi-hat hits or ride cymbal hits and just kind of move from one to the next. And if there's a bass drum or a snare drum underneath, you know when it's falling. But without that there, it's a lot trickier. So on page 27 of the book, we're going to look at how you can get better at reading these note values, but also the rest values as well. Because it's not necessarily the hits that are the problem, it's the space in between the hits. Now, fortunately, a lot of drum music is written in a way which makes this quite straightforward to get your head around. And this is down to the fact that in drums, we don't really have note length. The notes as they're written obviously have a certain length to them, but the drums themselves don't have that kind of sustain. Melodic instruments such as the piano or the violin or the bass, they have note length. You can press the key on the piano or you can pluck a string, and the length that you hold that key down for, or the length that you're holding that note on the bass for, it's just going to keep ringing until it runs out of energy. This is sustain, this is note length. The drums don't do that. We hit a snare drum, it goes bop. You could read a quarter note and hit the snare drum, or you could hit an eighth note and hit the snare drum, or hit a 16th note and hit the snare drum, and they're all going to sound the same. So note values in drumming are really more about the hit point and then how long you've got to wait until you can play the next thing. But because we don't have that sustain on the instrument of the drum kit, drum notation is actually slightly simplified. What you'll find most of the time, and this isn't all the time, but at least when you're at an introductory level, like grades 1 to 5, you'll often find that if you see a quarter note, then that quarter note is only going to be falling on beats 1, 2, 3, 4. Likewise, in the second example on page 27, if you see an eighth note on its own, and by that I mean the eighth note with a little tail coming off the top of it, this will only ever fall on an and. These two pieces of information make it very simple very quickly. Is it a quarter note? Yes, so it's going to be falling on a number. Is it an eighth note on its own? Yes, then it's going to be falling on an and. Now also, if there's a quarter note rest, that quarter note rest is also going to be falling on a number. 1, 2, 3, or 4. And if you see an eighth note on its own, and you know that's on the and position, you'll also see an eighth note rest just before it. And again, these rests are also falling on the numbers. So we have quarter note rests, and eighth note rests all falling on number counts. And an eighth note on its own will always be falling on an and. This information is what's going to help you make sense of grooves or bass drum, snare drum patterns when the hi-hats and ride cymbal aren't there. Let's look at exercise 3.1. First example. This example starts with 2 quarter notes. So as we've just said, that means that both of these are going to be falling on numbers. So that's going to be beat 1 and beat 2. The next thing we have is an 8th note rest. And we know this is also going to fall on a number. So that has to be beat 3 because that's the next number in the sequence. As this is an 8th note rest, the next thing that can happen is going to be the AND of 3. And that's where we see a note with a little tail. As I mentioned, when you see an 8th note on its own, that's falling on an AND. We also have another 8th note rest, which we know is on a number. That's going to be beat 4, followed by another 8th note on its own on the AND. So now we know that that first bar of exercise 3.1, first example, is going to go 1, 2, 3, and 4, and. Does that make sense? Let's look at the second bar in this first example. If you have a quick scan of this bar, you'll see there's 2 rests and 2 quarter notes in the bar. That actually highlights the numbers. The first rest is beat 1, the second rest is beat 2, the next quarter note is beat 3, and the last quarter note is beat 4. So now you know where beats 1, 2, 3, 4 are falling, and it also becomes a lot easier to know where those ands are falling. In this case, we have the and of 1 and the and of 2. And this first example is going to sound like 1 and 2 and 3, 4. So let's try this first example. Ready? Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
In the second example, we're starting the exercise with 2 8th notes joined together. Now you should already know that this means you're going to be playing 1 and. But everything else in the exercise is going to be similar to the one above. You can identify there's a rest there, that's going to be one of the numbers, and there's 2 other quarter notes in that bar, and that's also going to represent number hits. So try those other exercises. Maybe start with a speed of 60 BPM on your metronome and just work through them one at a time. Feel free to repeat the exercises, or you could even move from one to the next if you're feeling confident. Moving on to exercise 3.2. This is where things start to get a little trickier, but hopefully for you a little bit more interesting. And this is actually how you can start to develop your own ideas when it comes to drum solos, or even fills. All we have here is the same exercises from exercise 3.1, only instead of playing them on the snare drum, we're putting it between 2 voices. So the rhythms are all the same, and therefore the reading's very similar, only we're going to be playing them between the bass drum and the snare drum instead. Being able to take a rhythm and switching it between different voices of the kit is a really simple way of making an easy idea sound a lot more interesting and to get more creative with it. So let's try the first example in exercise 3.2. Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, be sure to try the remaining examples of exercise 3.2 before moving on to exercise 3.3. We're going to be staying with the bass drum and snare drum in exercise 3.3, only this time, rather than a 2-bar exercise, we're going to have an 8-bar exercise. So this is going to further strengthen your understanding of those note values and the space between, but also keep you on your toes moving between those 2 voices. Let's give it a try. 60 BPM. Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so sticking with the idea that we're going to be gradually building on a simple beginning point, we've got an 8-bar rhythm there between the bass drum and the snare drum. We're going to start making it a bit more interesting, get a bit more creative with it. So in exercise 3.4, we're sticking with exactly the same rhythm, but this time we're going to add a few new elements. We're going to throw in some flams, which we learned in the first lesson chapter, and we're also going to start adding some tom hits as well. So we're using a bit more of the kit, and we're using some new elements, those flams, to make the whole thing a little bit more creative, a little bit more interesting. Now, as mentioned previously, I don't actually have a mid-tom on my kit because I don't really like using one. So whenever there's a mid-tom in exercise 3.4, I'm going to be hitting the snare. Let's give it a try. Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, fantastic. Moving on to exercise 3.5. We're now going to elaborate on that previous idea a little bit more. And all we're going to do is that in some areas, we're going to add some 16th notes. So instead of just playing 8th notes and quarter notes, we've now got a few 16th notes in there as well. Let's give it a try. Here we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So to recap, a good way of creating ideas, be that a fill or be that any kind of short drum solo, start with a simple pattern. So start with a rhythm. This could be based on a melody in a song, or it could just be something that you create on the spot. But imagine that rhythm first of all on something like a snare drum. Then see if you can move that pattern between the bass drum and the snare drum to give it some more variation. And perhaps then you also want to throw in some toms, some flams, and perhaps some other note values such as 16th notes. This is a really good way of taking a simple idea and elaborating on it step by step in order to make something that sounds way more interesting. But the journey along the way isn't too taxing. It's quite easy to process that as you go. That's where we'll leave things today. If you still need access to the book Intermediate 1 that we're working through, you can find it on my website, www.ihitdrums.co.uk. This is available as a paperback or an ebook. Be sure to subscribe to receive regular updates and to access that free Groove Starter Pack. But until next time, enjoy!